Welcome, dear listener. As we begin this slow descent into the shadowed corners of medieval justice, I invite you to get comfortable, breathe deeply, and let the noise of the day slip quietly into the background. If you'd like, feel free to share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always a quiet comfort to see just how far this little gathering of late-night minds and sleepy history lovers reaches. And if these gentle, reflective wanderings through the darker paths of the past help you rest, consider subscribing for more soft-spoken stories like this one. It is just before dawn in a small English village, somewhere in the 14th century, and the mist still clings to the ground like breath exhaled from the soil itself, curling along the frost-stiff grass and creeping over the cobbles that lead to the town square, where a wooden structure waits in eerie stillness, its frame worn by rain, sun, and many pairs of struggling feet. The pillory stands alone for now, empty, but soon it will hold its next occupant, an unfortunate soul convicted of theft or blasphemy or some other petty crime that has earned them not death, but shame. And in this world, sometimes shame was worse. Punishment in medieval times was rarely quiet. It was loud, public, drawn out. It was a message wrapped in suffering, shouted through splinters, blood, and broken pride. The pillory was not designed to kill, but to humiliate, to reduce a person to a spectacle, their face and hands locked into wooden stocks, exposed to the laughter and cruelty of neighbors and strangers alike. As the sky grows pale, the townspeople begin to gather, some out of obligation, others out of boredom, and many more out of a deep, unspoken hunger for the feeling of being better than someone else. A cart rattles into view, pulled by a weary horse, carrying the condemned, a man whose crime is already being whispered about. Some say he stole bread, others say he insulted the local priest. No one seems to agree, and no one seems to care. He is dragged from the cart, his tunic torn, his face already smeared with dirt. He does not fight. Fighting makes it worse. He is shoved toward the pillory, and the wooden frame creaks as it swings open, the top half lifted so that his neck and wrists can be fitted in place. Then it slams down, locking him in. The sound is sharp, final. The crowd murmurs. A child throws a handful of mud. Someone spits. His body twitches, but he cannot wipe his face. He cannot shield his eyes from the rising sun. He cannot move at all. He is helpless, and that is the point. The hours pass slowly. The town goes about its day while he stands there, bent and bound, a living warning to all who pass. Birds land near him, peck at the ground. Flies gather. The wind picks up, and the chill sinks into his joints. Sometimes people come close and shout insults. Sometimes they throw worse: rotten vegetables, stones, whatever they can find. The law permits it, encourages it. Even, this is justice, they say. This is order. But what it really is cruelty disguised as righteousness. By midday, his knees have buckled, but the stocks hold him upright. His fingers have gone numb. His mouth is dry. He cannot speak. He can only endure. He can only wait. And this is one of the lighter punishments. Others are far worse. The rack, the wheel, the iron boot. But even this simple, seemingly harmless sentence leaves behind scars that never fade. When he is finally released, hours later, the sun low in the sky, and the crowd mostly gone, he collapses to the ground. No one helps him up. The guards step over him. The villagers ignore him. He is free now, they say. But in truth, he is not. The stocks have not just held his body. They have broken something inside him, taken something he may never get back. And still, another will take his place tomorrow, and another the day after that. Because there is always someone to punish, always someone to humiliate, always someone the town needs to feel better than. The pillory stands waiting, its wood stained by time and tears, and the square will never be quiet for long. In a shadowed corner of the city, beyond the market's final stall, and past the alleyways where the drunk and desperate wander, there once stood a wooden post set into the earth like a forgotten monument, plain but terrible, for it bore the rusted chains and iron manacles of the whipping post, a punishment as old as the laws that made it necessary. A sentence dealt not in isolation or death, but in slow, deliberate pain meant to ripple out into the watching crowd. It begins, always, with the sound of the decree, clear, cold, and unflinching, spoken aloud by a town crier or a constable. The crime listed with stiff formality, the sentence laid bare, lashes, a number agreed upon by the courts, often 39, sometimes more, rarely less, always enough to mark the back and the memory. The condemned arrives under guard, flanked by men who do not smile, though some carry a cruel kind of satisfaction in the stiffness of their posture, the grip of their hands. The accused might be shirtless already, or stripped there in the square before all eyes, the chill biting at their skin, the jeers of the crowd louder than the wind. Some crimes are trivial: stealing firewood, missing church, speaking out of turn, but the punishment is not. It is never trivial. The whipping post is a place of noise and blood. The victim is tied with rough rope, arms extended, chest pressed to the splintering grain of the wood. The whip is no theatrical prop, but a tool of leather and weight, designed to bite, to bruise, to break. When the first lash lands, the sound is sharper than most remember. The whistle, the crack, the intake of breath from the crowd, and the low, guttural sound that escapes from the one being punished. There is rhythm in this brutality, a pause between each stroke, just enough for the pain to set in before the next arrives. The whip draws blood before long. It always does. It tears through flesh with repetition, carving lines like writing on skin, and the back becomes a map of agony, red and wet. The old wounds crisscrossing with the new. Some faint. Some scream. Some bite their tongues to hold in the sound, believing wrongly that silence will preserve some measure of dignity. But pain is a thief. It strips away pride, strength, even memory. The crowd watches, and they are the worst part. For some, this is entertainment, a distraction from toil, from poverty, from their own closeness to the line between observer and victim. Children point. Old men nod solemnly, Women whisper, some with pity, some with disdain. And when the final lash falls, there is no applause, only a quiet dispersal, the square emptying like a theater after the final act. The punished is cut loose, their legs often unable to hold them, their back a ruin of flesh and sweat. Sometimes they are left there, bleeding in the mud, until someone takes pity or night falls. Infection is common. Scars are guaranteed. The mark of the whip never leaves, even after the flesh heals. It lingers in posture, in the way a person winces at loud sounds, in the way they flinch when hands move too quickly. The whipping post does not kill, at least not most of the time, but it changes people. It reshapes them. And it reminds everyone who sees it that obedience is not asked for. It is demanded. The post stands long after the punishment ends, its wood darkened by years of sweat and blood, its iron rings cold and waiting. There is no honor here, no mercy. Only the wind whispering through the square and the memory of screams carried on it like ashes. In the damp lower reaches of the city, where the air hangs thick with rot and mildew, down a flight of mossy steps that lead beneath the courthouse or the castle or whatever building happens to hold the authority of the day, there lies the oubliette, a cell not built for punishment in the moment, but for punishment in time, in endless crushing silence. From the French word meaning to forget, the oubliette is more pit than room, a vertical shaft carved into the earth or stone, often barely wider than a man's outstretched arms, with no light, no bed, no water beyond what leaks through the cracks above or trickles down the walls. There is no door in an oubliette, only a hatch in the ceiling, a hole through which a prisoner is lowered or dropped and then sealed away. The descent is final. No ladder, no rope left behind, just darkness, total and absolute, swallowing them whole. There is no air movement, only the stale breath of centuries and the slow decay of anything left within. Some oubliettes were used for days, some for weeks, some forever. The person inside might have been a traitor, a noble fallen out of favor, a servant who overheard too much, or simply someone the powerful wished to erase. Trials were optional, justice irrelevant. It was a punishment designed not to end suffering quickly, but to let it stretch, unseen, unheard, unremarked upon, until the person vanished in every sense of the word. Imagine the first hours, the confusion, the frantic shouting, the clawing at stone, the realization that no one is coming, that no one knows where you are, that even if they did, they would not help. The floor is damp, sometimes flooded, sometimes crawling with things better not described. There is no room to stretch. Sometimes no room even to sit. Just standing in the dark or crouching, pressed against cold, unforgiving stone. Hunger arrives first, then thirst, but worse is the sound of your own breathing, the beating of your heart, the voice inside your mind that begins to grow louder with every hour that passes. Time bends in the oubliette. Days feel like weeks. A moment feels like a memory. The brain turns against itself in that tight, airless dark. Hallucinations come, shapes in the pitch, voices that aren't there, laughter that sounds like weeping, The body wastes, the mind frays, and yet the world above moves on, forgets. That is the point. The oubliette is not just a cell, it is an erasure, a place not only to confine, but to unmake. When the hatch is finally opened, if it ever is, it's not to retrieve, but to dispose. Bones, sometimes. A collapsed figure, no longer able to speak. Filth. Silence. And then the hatch closes again. Cleaned, perhaps. Maybe not. Ready for the next secret, the next mistake, the next person who needs to be disappeared. There are no markers for those left in oubliettes. No gravestones, no names. Just the hole, waiting in the dark, and the long, echoing memory of those who learn too late that some punishments aren't loud or bloody or swift. Some punishments are quiet and endless and buried. In the bustling square where the market once thrives with color and chatter, where fruit sellers call to passing women and the clang of a blacksmith's hammer rings faintly from a distant corner, there arrives a kind of stillness. Not the quiet of rest, but the hush that falls before something terrible. A pause in the rhythm of life as the executioner steps into view, followed by guards and the condemned. And the object at the center of this moment stands tall and grim, the gallows. Made from simple timber, roughly hewn and often reused, the gallows is a structure that needs no decoration. Its purpose is written in its shape, the beam that stretches above, the rope that hangs with casual cruelty, swaying slightly in the breeze like it's already grown impatient. Hanging was one of the most common punishments in medieval justice, not because it was quick or clean or fair, but because it was effective. It killed, yes, but more than that, it displayed, it warned, it entertained. The condemned walks with steps that are sometimes defiant, sometimes broken, sometimes held up by others when their legs no longer wish to move. The noose waits above them like an old friend. They are made to climb, each step a betrayal of hope, onto the wooden platform where the rope is adjusted, tightened, looped behind the ear. There is often a priest. There is sometimes a confession, mumbled or shouted, but it rarely matters. The crowd has gathered not for absolution, but for spectacle. There are children on shoulders, vendors walking the edge of the scene, selling meat pies and cider. Some people cry, others laugh. Most watch in silence, eyes sharp, necks craned. Then comes the moment, the lever pulled, or the stool kicked, the drop. If done well, the neck breaks instantly, and the body jerks once, twice, then hangs still. If done poorly, and it often is, the drop is too short, the rope too slack, and the body dances for minutes, legs kicking, face purple, tongue swollen, the sound of choking filling the square in waves. No one stops it. That is the punishment. That is the point. To be seen dying, to die badly. Afterward, the body might be cut down and buried in unconsecrated ground, or it might be left, days, weeks, as a warning, as a message. The flesh bloats, blackens, draws flies. Ravens gather, children dare each other to run beneath the swinging feet. Justice, they say. But what justice is this? What dignity? What mercy? None. Hanging is not about balance. It is about finality, about showing power, keeping order, making fear visible. The gallows creaks even when empty, the wind catching the rope like a memory that refuses to let go. And the people pass by, day after day, beneath its shadow, pretending not to look, pretending it's just another piece of the town. But they remember. Everyone remembers. Because once you've heard the sound of a body falling, the rope groaning beneath its weight, the last breath forced from unwilling lungs, you do not forget. You carry it like a stone, like a whisper, like a rope tightening around your own neck, slowly, invisibly, with every unjust law, every cruel sentence, every silence that follows a scream. In the bitter heart of winter, when the rivers have frozen and the roads are lined with brittle ice, there is still warmth to be found, not from fire or hearth, but from the crowds gathering near the town's edge, drawn by rumor and hunger for the strange satisfaction that comes from watching another suffer in the name of order, of law, of retribution. Today, it is the cucking stool, a punishment reserved not for the violent or the thieving, but for those who offended the fragile balance of behavior. Scolds, nags, gossips, and women who spoke too freely, too loudly, or simply too often. The stool itself is crude, a wooden chair mounted at the end of a long beam, balanced like a seesaw over a river or a filthy pond, sometimes mounted to a cart, sometimes set on rails to be paraded through the streets. The condemned is led forward, hands bound, expression torn between shame and fury. Most often, it is a woman. Her crime might be a quarrel with a neighbor, a few too many sharp words at market, or accusations whispered by someone more powerful who simply wished her quiet. There is no real defense against such charges. A label of scold sticks easily, like mud, and the punishment follows swiftly. She is tied to the stool, arms fastened to the rests, ankles lashed to the legs. There is no comfort here. The wood bites into flesh. The cold seeps through fabric and into bone. The townspeople line the banks, jostling for a better view, some with laughter in their throats, others with uneasy silence on their lips. The executioner, or sometimes just a common man with the right authority, grabs the handle of the beam and begins to pivot it, slow at first, the chair swinging out over the frozen water, creaking ominously. A moment's pause, then down. The splash is loud, final, shocking against the quiet morning air. Her body disappears beneath the surface, and for a moment, the world seems to hold its breath. Then she's lifted, soaked and gasping, hair plastered to her face, limbs shivering violently. Before she can catch her breath, down again, over and over. The rhythm of humiliation, the ritual of cold. The crowd watches, sometimes clapping, sometimes jeering. This is meant to cleanse, to punish, to reform, but it is torture. Slow drowning, followed by momentary reprieve. Gasp, submerge, gasp, again, again. Some scream, some go limp. Some emerge from the water changed forever, voice gone, mind broken, the chill never quite leaving their bones. And the worst part? There is no permanent record, no mark, no grave. The punishment is public, but leaves no monument. Only the memory of faces in the crowd and the sting of silence after the laughter dies away. The stool is pulled back to shore. The woman is cut loose and left to stumble home, soaked and trembling. There is no apology, no redemption, only the cold and the knowledge that her voice, her presence, will now always be accompanied by a shadow. And the cucking stool waits, quiet, dripping, ready for the next name whispered by a husband, a neighbor, a priest. The river does not care. It receives each victim the same. The town does not care. It forgets until it remembers. And the chair waits, a simple thing, cruel in its purpose, empty until it is not. The square is quiet again, not from mercy, but from anticipation, because today is no ordinary punishment. It is the breaking wheel, a sentence reserved for those whose crimes are considered beyond forgiveness, whose existence itself is declared an affront to order. And God, though often those chosen for the wheel are not the wickedest, only the most unlucky, the most hated, or the most expendable. The wheel stands tall, wide, a cartwheel stripped of its purpose, mounted to a frame so the crowd can see every grim detail. Its spokes are thick, its rim worn smooth by the weight of bodies, and at its foot lies a mallet, a sledge really, heavy as truth and just as final. The condemned is dragged forward, bound already, limbs trembling not with resistance, but with the kind of fear that lives deeper than the flesh. Some are silent, already broken by the dungeon or the knowledge of what is to come. Others scream, curse, pray, none escape. The executioner steps forward, masked or not. It does not matter. What matters is the sequence, the ritual, the method. The victim is splayed across the wheel, arms and legs stretched across the gaps in the spokes, bound tightly, joints exposed, vulnerable. And then it begins. The sledge rises and falls, slow and deliberate, not striking to kill, but to break. Each bone shattered becomes a sound, a lesson, a message. The femurs first, crack. The radius and ulna, crack. The knees, the elbows, the shins, the ankles, crack, crack, crack. The rhythm is grotesque, the crowd murmuring or cheering or simply staring. The body twitches, curls, jerks, but the bindings hold firm. The condemned does not die quickly. That is the design. The wheel is not about death. It is about destruction. About turning a person into ruin, limb by limb, piece by piece, until they are no longer recognizable as the being who stood before the crowd only moments ago. Sometimes, when the breaking is complete, the body is threaded through the wheel, bent and woven between the spokes, displayed like a grotesque sculpture, then hoisted high onto a pole, where it is left to die if not already dead, and then rot. Birds come first, then time, rain, sun, frost. The wheel becomes a gallows in the air, a warning visible from the road, from the hill, from the fields beyond. Here is what happens. It says, without speaking, to those who cross the wrong line. But the truth is, the line is not always clear. The condemned might have been a bandit, yes, but just as easily a rebel, a debtor, a foreigner, someone useful as a lesson, someone easy to hate. The wheel does not care. Its wood is soaked with the history of countless deaths, and it creaks in the wind like it remembers everyone. No monument is raised for those broken on the wheel. No prayers are said beyond those muttered in fear by the crowd. The site is swept clean eventually, but the stains remain in the grain of the wood, in the dust of the road, in the memory of those who watched and those who heard about it later and dreamed of it still. Because the wheel isn't just an object, it's a ritual, a statement, a way of saying, we will not just kill you, we will unmake you. And it waits now, still and silent, as the crowd finally disperses, as the sun leans westward, as another name is whispered to the authorities in a back room, and the next wheel-bound morning slowly begins to turn. In the shadow of castle walls and beside the iron gates of fortified cities, there was once a punishment so simple and so cruel that it required no fire, no blood, no iron or whip, just stillness, time, and the indifference of weather. It was known as the pillory, a wooden structure with holes for the head and hands, sometimes for the feet, set at just the right height to display the punished like livestock, not for slaughter, but for ridicule. At first glance, it seems almost tame, even theatrical. A man or woman locked in place, exposed to the street, their limbs trapped in heavy timber as onlookers pass. But the pillory was not soft. It was not merciful. It was humiliation, sharpened into a weapon, and the wound it left did not fade easily. The accused, be they a thief, a liar, a debtor, or someone guilty only of angering the wrong official, would be led to the square, sometimes barefoot, often jeered before the punishment even began. The pillory stood waiting, a crude frame of timber worn smooth by use and stained darker where sweat and spit had dried. The prisoner's neck was placed into the central notch, hands into the flanking ones, and the upper board was closed with a heavy iron pin. There was no room to move, no comfort. Muscles cramped, shoulders burned, legs went numb. But the real punishment had not yet begun. It was the people, the crowd, that completed the sentence. They came with rotten fruit, old eggs, dung from the stables, mud from the street. They hurled insults, then objects, aiming for the face, the eyes, the mouth. Spittle flew. Laughter rang out. Some threw stones, not large enough to kill, but enough to bruise, to cut. Children laughed. Old men judged. Women whispered with hands to their mouths. And always, the accused could do nothing but endure it. No wiping of the face, no shielding of the eyes. Just hours beneath the sun or rain, in heat or frost, with the whole world invited to participate in their undoing. If they fainted, they remained upright. If they vomited, it spilled down their front and stayed there. Birds sometimes perched above, adding insult from the sky, and should the crowd grow unruly, or if the prisoner had made enemies, the violence might escalate beyond the intention of the law. Many left the pillory with broken noses, missing teeth, or infections that set in days later. Some never recovered from the public shame. They became marked people, their faces remembered, their names repeated like cautionary tales. Even after the boards were lifted and the prisoner stumbled free, the punishment clung to them. Their neighbors stared longer. Friends disappeared. Work dried up. And the shame, invisible but heavy, settled into their bones. Yet the pillory remained. It was not taken down, not hidden away. It stood in the square as a constant promise, one that said, "You are always one mistake away from this." And in that still, open frame, with its rusting hinges and splintered surface, the townsfolk saw not justice, but a mirror, one they prayed would never reflect them. In the cold corners of certain cities, often near the edge of a cemetery or in the forgotten courtyard of a prison, there once stood a punishment so slow, so deliberate in its cruelty, that it blurred the line between death and dying. This was the gibbet, not the gallows, though it looked similar at first, but a twisted echo of it, where the sentence didn't end with the drop, but only truly began after the final breath had left the body. To be gibbeted meant to be displayed after death, suspended in a cage of iron bands shaped to hold a corpse upright, or hung by chains from a tall wooden post where the body would swing with the wind. It was not always for murderers, sometimes for highwaymen, pirates, rebels, deserters, those whose crime struck fear or defiance in the hearts of rulers and lawmen. The execution came first, often by hanging, but instead of burial, the body was stripped and placed into the gibbet cage, its joints locked into the awkward embrace of rusted metal. Fingers curled through the bars, heads lolled forward. Eyes, when they remained, were left open to the sky. The gibbet was hoisted high, always high, above crossroads, above harbor mouths, above bridges and borders, so that all who passed could see what waited for those who broke the rules too boldly. And then it hung. Days turned to weeks. The sun blackened the skin. Rain soaked the bones. Birds came, crows, ravens, gulls, and picked at the face, the hands, the softest parts. Maggots worked their way through the openings. The stench stretched for miles. Children were warned not to look too long. Horses shied at the scent. But the cage stayed. Because the point of gibbeting wasn't justice. It was memory. It was fear. It was the long echo of punishment that refused to fade even after the scream had gone silent. Some bodies lasted months, in cold seasons longer. They became familiar in a way no one wanted. People began giving them names, telling stories, pointing them out to travelers as if they were milestones. That one was a thief, they'd say. That one killed a noble. No one ever said their real names. They weren't people anymore. They were warnings, markers on the edge of life, standing between what was allowed and what was not. And when the gibbet finally gave way, when a storm snapped the post or rust wore through the chains, the body was often left where it fell. Sometimes buried in the mud beneath, sometimes dragged into a ditch, but always replaced, eventually, by another. Because the gibbet wasn't a one-time punishment. It was a system, a spectacle, a message carved in bone and iron that said, "We own not only your life, but what comes after." And even now, in quiet fields or under crumbling bridges, rusted rings and old posts still stand, forgotten by most, but not by the wind. not by the ground, not by the history that remembers how long a body can swing, how long a punishment can echo when cruelty is given height and time and silence. There was a kind of punishment in the medieval world that did not rely on the spectacle of blood or the finality of death, but instead turned time itself into a tool of torment, a punishment so intimate, so quiet, and so persistent that it wore away at the body and the mind like a stone eroding under centuries of rain. It was called the oubliette, and it was not a cell in the way we understand it, but a hole, a vertical shaft dug deep into the floor of a castle or dungeon, sometimes lined with stone, often with no light, no air, no sound except what echoed faintly from above. The word means to forget, and that is exactly what it did. The prisoner dropped into the oubliette was not meant to be seen again. There was no trial, no sentence to be served and concluded. The punishment was absence, disappearance, erasure. The opening might be sealed with a stone slab or covered with iron bars just wide enough to let food drop through. But often there was no food, no water, only darkness. The fall itself could break bones. Some oubliettes were shallow enough to leave a man standing in filth, others deep enough that the prisoner could not reach the walls or climb, their screams rising only to fade unheard in the world above. There was no room to stretch, no light to track the days. You slept standing. You aged without knowing how. The air was wet, thick with mold, filled with the stink of old rot and damp stone. Rats sometimes fell in. So did insects. And you, forgotten by the court that ordered your silence, began to unravel. Your thoughts echoed back at you until you weren't sure if they were yours. Your skin grew pale, your nails long. Time stopped being something you measured and became something that pressed against you, heavy and slow, like the stone around your prison. Some died within days. Others lasted longer, but all were changed. And if by some chance you were pulled from the oubliette because a new lord took the castle or someone remembered your name, it was not a rescue. It was an awakening into a world that had moved on without you. Many could no longer speak. Some could no longer stand. Their eyes recoiled from the light. Their hands trembled at the sound of voices. They were not freed, only relocated from one kind of silence to another. And the oubliette remained, a dark mouth in the stone, empty until it wasn't. No one decorated it. No one spoke of it openly, but its presence was known. It was whispered about by servants and feared by prisoners. A reminder that you did not need to be killed to be punished. You only needed to be buried in time, in darkness, in memory. And for the unlucky, for the silenced, for the forgotten, the oubliette was not just a place. It was an ending that pretended not to be an ending at all. Just a door closed. Just a voice no longer heard. Just a name erased in the quiet. Some punishments weren't meant to kill you, but they weren't meant to let you live either. Not properly, not fully, not without pain written into the shape of your body forever. Branding was one of those punishments, a sentence not of blood, but of fire, of searing heat pressed to bare skin until it screamed louder than the voice ever could. It was a mark that could not be hidden, not completely, not ever, and that was the point. In the medieval world, justice didn't end when the punishment was done. It lingered, carved into flesh, a walking warning, a label for all to see. The tools were simple: an iron rod forged with a letter, a shape, a symbol, V for thief in some places, or F for felon, or a cross, or a circle, each sign meaning something grim, something damning. The iron was heated until it glowed, orange at first, then white, a color that doesn't belong to anything soft or kind. The condemned would be restrained, sometimes held down by guards, sometimes bound to a post, shirt torn open, hair cut away if necessary. And then, without ceremony, the brand would be pressed into the flesh: shoulder, cheek, forehead, chest. The hiss of burning skin, the sharp stink of cooked flesh, the immediate howl of pain. Some bit down on leather. Some fainted. Some didn't scream at all, not because it didn't hurt, but because the hurt was so deep, so absolute, that the voice couldn't find its way out. And then it was done. The iron pulled back, the wound red and smoking. Salve might be offered, but rarely. Infection was common. Some wounds festered. Some scars twisted and deepened until they became grotesque. But all of them lasted. That was the purpose. The branded person could never truly return to normal life. Every shirt that slipped, every wind that blew back a cloak, every glance that lingered too long in the marketplace, it all told the story again. You were not a person. You were a category, a thief, a traitor, a whore, a heretic. Even if your crime had been surviving, or disobeying, or angering the wrong man, the brand didn't care. It didn't explain. It only condemned. And there was no appeal, no forgiveness. Time did not heal this wound. It only made it quieter. Some tried to burn it off again, to make it unrecognizable. Others tattooed over it, turned it into something else. But the shape remained, ghosted in the skin, and those who saw it understood, or thought they did. The brand didn't just change the body, it changed the life. Work became scarce. Trust even scarcer. Some branded folk turned inward, became reclusive, silent. Others embraced the identity forced upon them, becoming what they were accused of. A few wore their marks like armor, like a dare, but most simply endured, living not in fear, but in aftermath. And somewhere, in a cold chamber or blacksmith's forge, the branding iron waits again, dull now, but easily made hot, easily made ready. Because the past is always close in places like that. Because someone, somewhere, will always believe that pain makes truth, and that fire makes justice. There were times in the medieval world when punishment wasn't just inflicted to correct or to control, but to publicly destroy the body in a way that echoed like thunder across the square, a warning so loud it didn't need words. Flaying was one such punishment, rare but real, and so unspeakably brutal that it still lingers in the imagination like a shadow that never moves. To be flayed alive meant to be peeled, to have the very skin removed from the body, slowly, deliberately, often while still breathing, still aware, still able to feel every inch of the blade's progress. The sentence was carried out for treason most often, for rebellion or betrayal, as if to say that turning against the crown or the church meant losing not just your life, but the very surface of yourself. It didn't begin with ceremony. It began with stripping. The condemned was bound, arms above the head, legs spread, back arched or slumped depending on how the executioners wanted to work. The blade was small, sharp, curved. Sometimes the process started at the legs, sometimes the face, depending on whether they wanted the condemned to see what was happening or feel it longer. The first cuts were shallow, just beneath the skin, a layer we rarely think of, but live in every day. Then came the lifting, the peeling, inch by inch. The skin was separated from the flesh beneath. It didn't come off cleanly. It tore. It clung. It bled. The body isn't meant to be open like that. The muscles beneath pulsed and shivered, raw and red, exposed to air and dirt and the stares of the crowd, because there was always a crowd. No matter how terrible the punishment, people came. They came to gasp, to whisper, to point, to pray it would never be them. Some looked away. Most didn't. Flaying could last for hours. The executioners had to be careful. Not too fast, or death would come early. Not too slow, or the condemned might go mad before the lesson had sunk in. The face was often last. The eyes wide, the mouth dry. The screams hoarse or gone. Some victims passed out. Some begged. Some stayed silent to the end. But always, the air was thick with iron and heat and something deeper, something like horror made real. If the flaying didn't kill them outright, and sometimes it didn't, they were left to die slowly, the exposed flesh vulnerable to infection, to flies, to the simple cruelty of being touched by the wind. And if death came first, the punishment wasn't over. The skin, once removed, might be tanned like leather, hung in the square, nailed to the city gate, turned into a banner of warning. This, it said without words, is what happens to traitors. No trial was needed, or if there was, it was brief. No mercy was shown, not even in death. And those who watched went home changed, not because they pitied the condemned, but because they understood the message. The body is not sacred. It is law's canvas. It can be shaped, stripped, remade into a symbol. And once the square was washed, and the skin hung high, and the echo of screams had faded into the stones, the town would go on. Markets open, bells ring, children laugh. But beneath it all, the memory remained, like a wound in the stone. Because punishment like that doesn't vanish. It stains the place, and it lingers, always. Among the most haunting punishments the medieval world devised was one that turned the very act of sitting into suffering, the weight of the body itself used as a tool of torment. It was called the Judas cradle, and it was not a machine of speed or spectacle, but of steady, patient cruelty. The condemned would be stripped, fully, completely, because shame was part of the sentence. Then they would be hoisted above a wooden pyramid, its point smooth, sometimes greased, always cold. The legs were spread wide, tied with rope, and slowly, with deliberate control, the person was lowered down until their weight began to settle on that sharp, unrelenting point. There was no sudden drop, no screaming fall, only the unbearable, creeping pressure as the pyramid pushed into the most vulnerable parts of the body. The skin stretched, muscles resisted, then tore. The spine arched instinctively, trying to ease the pain, but there was no relief. Every shift, every flinch, only added more agony. The pyramid did not break skin immediately. It was designed to prolong. Hours could pass, sometimes days. The condemned might be hoisted back up and lowered again, repeatedly, the ropes creaking above, their limbs shaking, their breath hitching in shallow gasps. There was no blood at first, only silence and sweat and the awful grind of flesh against wood. But in time, the body gave in, tissues tore. Bleeding began, often deep inside. Infection followed quickly, and the pain, already immense, became fevered, trembling, wild. Flies gathered, feces mixed with blood. The stench rose. Some prisoners screamed, some begged, others went silent, their minds retreating to a place far away from the torment they could not escape. The crowd, if there was one, did not cheer. The Judas cradle wasn't a public punishment, like the stocks or the gallows. It was done in cold stone rooms, torchlit chambers, interrogators standing by with unreadable faces. It was a punishment for traitors, for heretics, for those accused of crimes against faith or crown that demanded not only silence, but submission. The pyramid forced you down, not just in body, but in spirit. It took away dignity, voice, and finally life. Not always from bleeding, but from infection, or exhaustion, or the simple collapse of the will. There was no mercy, no swiftness, just time and weight, and the sharp truth that pain, sustained long enough, becomes its own language. And when the prisoner finally died, whether on the point or days later from what it had done to them, the cradle was wiped, washed, set aside, ready for the next. The pyramid never changed, only the names, only the faces, only the echoes left behind in the walls. And long after the screams faded, long after the blood dried, those walls remembered. They always did, in the dim corridors of medieval torment. Few punishments clung so tightly to both spectacle and agony as being broken on the wheel. A punishment not for reform, but for obliteration, slow and public, where every bone in the body was turned into a message. They called it the breaking wheel, or sometimes simply the wheel, though there was nothing simple about what it did. The condemned would be brought into a square or up a hillside, somewhere high enough for the wind to carry their screams and the crows to circle long before it was over. There was a rhythm to it, cruel and measured. First, the body was stripped, then stretched out, tied to the ground or suspended on a wooden frame. Sometimes, limbs were slotted through spokes, other times placed carefully on blocks to ensure they would not give under the hammer's weight. The executioner held a large iron bar or club, not sharp, not clean, just heavy enough to crush without cutting. And then he began, blow after blow, systematic, arm, leg, arm again, leg again. Each bone shattered not with a scream, but with a crack like dry wood snapping underfoot. The limbs twisted, bent unnaturally, skin tearing, muscle pulling away from broken joints. The condemned, often remained conscious through much of it, their voice fading in and out, blood pooling beneath them, their body reshaped by pain. And still, the crowd watched, not for entertainment exactly, but for reassurance. That justice, no matter how brutal, would leave nothing behind that could rise again. After the bones were broken, the body, sometimes still alive, was woven through the wheel, threaded between the spokes like a grotesque tapestry. The arms bent around one way, the legs another. It was not elegant. It was not fast. The wheel was then raised on a post, high into the air, tilted just so that the body looked not like a man anymore, but a warning. If death had not come from the blows, it would come now, from shock, from exposure, from thirst, from the slow failure of organs too bruised to work. Some lasted hours. A few, incredibly, survived into the next day. The birds always came first. Crows, drawn by the stillness. Then the flies. And beneath it all, the silence of a town that had witnessed not just execution, but erasure. The wheel didn't just kill. It removed. It undid. It said, "This is what happens to traitors, to murderers, to those who defy the order of things." The body was left for days, sometimes longer, and when it was finally taken down, if it was taken down, it was burned or buried in a pit without a name. The wheel itself, cleaned, stored, used again. It did not tire. It did not remember. But the people did. They walked past the place slower. They looked to the sky more often, and in the back of their minds, they carried the shape of the broken man on the wheel, his arms bent like branches, his face turned to the sun, not because they wanted to, but because punishment like that leaves a mark deeper than fear. It leaves a silence that never quite ends. In a world where justice was meant to be felt as much as feared, there existed a punishment designed not only to strip a man of his body, but to turn his very death into a slow unraveling. A punishment so carefully cruel, so exquisitely calibrated to pain, that it bordered on ritual. It was called being hanged, drawn, and quartered. The sentence reserved for traitors, for those whose crimes were seen not merely as offenses, but as wounds against the entire kingdom. It did not begin with death. It began with humiliation. The condemned would be paraded through the streets, tied to a wooden hurdle or sled, dragged behind horses while the crowd jeered, spat, threw refuse, sometimes stones. Bound tightly, often naked, exposed to wind and judgment, the man was pulled through town to the scaffold, not to be executed, but to be undone, piece by piece. The drawing referred not to this dragging, though it often broke bones and tore skin, but to what came after. At the scaffold, the man was strung up, not hanged to die, but hanged to suffer. A short drop, a tightened rope, enough to cut off breath, but not to end it. The body convulsed, eyes bulging, legs kicking wildly, hands grasping at nothing. Before death could arrive, the executioner would cut him down. Still conscious, gasping, choking, the man was then strapped down, and the true punishment began. The next part was the disembowelment. With the crowd still watching, some silent, some shouting, the executioner would open the abdomen, carefully, methodically. The intestines were pulled out slowly, sometimes burned before the man's eyes, sometimes flung aside, slick and steaming. The stomach, the bowels, even the genitals, all removed, piece by piece. Some men lost consciousness. Some remained awake. And then, only then, came the death, the beheading. Swift, almost merciful by comparison. But even then, the ritual was not finished. The body, already violated beyond recognition, was cut into 4 parts, quartered, sometimes by axe, sometimes by ropes and horses. The head was placed on a spike, often above a city gate. The quarters were sent to different towns, hung at crossroads or over bridges, reminders written in flesh. In the name of the traitor, seldom spoken again. Mothers pulled their children closer as they passed the blackened remains swinging in the wind. Fathers said nothing, eyes lowered. And yet, the memory clung. Because this punishment was never truly about the man himself. It was about what he represented. The idea that disloyalty was not just punished, it was erased, cut apart, scattered. Even in death, there would be no wholeness, no rest, only silence, only warning. And long after the bones had crumbled, long after the gates had been replaced and the spikes had rusted to nothing, people still remembered the shape of that fear. They spoke of it in quiet rooms. They traced its outline in stories told at dusk. Because punishment like that doesn't vanish. It roots itself in the soil, in the stones, in the hush that falls when someone asks, "What happened here?" And no one wants to answer. There were punishments in the medieval world that were not meant for swift death or grand spectacle, but for slow suffering in the dark corners of a town, where the cold seeped through stone and time stood still. One of the most quietly horrifying was the oubliette, a place whose name comes from the French word oublier, meaning to forget. And that was exactly what it was for. It was a prison, but not in the way we imagine. It was not a cell with bars or a dungeon with chains and moaning neighbors. It was a hole. A narrow, vertical shaft dug into the floor of a castle or a tower, often no wider than a man's shoulders. There was no door, only a trapdoor above, and once the prisoner was lowered, or more often dropped, inside, it was closed again, locked, gone. And so was the prisoner. The oubliette wasn't meant to kill you immediately. It was meant to erase you. You couldn't stand properly. You couldn't sit comfortably. The walls were damp, sometimes slimy with mold. The floor was cold, wet with runoff or worse. Rats sometimes found their way in. There was no torch, no candle. The dark was complete, thick and total. You would wake into it, sleep into it, dream in it, and never see your own hands again. Days passed without measure. Time slipped away. The only sounds were your own breath, the rustle of vermin, the distant echo of life continuing above you. Footsteps, a laugh, the creak of wood. Food might come once a day, lowered in a bucket, or not at all. Some prisoners were kept alive this way for months, others years. Some were forgotten entirely, either on purpose or by the slow turning of politics and war. When they were finally discovered, if they ever were, they were no longer themselves. Skin like paper, eyes unseeing, voice barely more than a whisper. The mind unraveled in silence. Some spoke to themselves until their words became meaningless. Others screamed, but only for a while. Eventually, the scream dies out. It always does. And the stone listens. The oubliette didn't leave scars on the body like flaying or branding. It left them in the mind. It carved you into silence. It turned you into a shadow that lived briefly and then was swallowed whole. No trial, no witness, no marker. Just a hole in the ground and the soft click of a lock. And above, the castle went on. Torches flickered in the hallways. Guards laughed over dice. Servants swept the same stone steps day after day. And beneath it all, someone sat in the dark, waiting or not waiting, or forgetting what waiting even was. That was the true punishment of the oubliette. Not death, but disappearance. And centuries later, when these pits are discovered beneath ruins, people peer inside and whisper. They imagine bones. They imagine ghosts. But what lingers isn't always a spirit. Sometimes it's just the memory of a breath that once echoed in a hole meant to make the world forget it was ever drawn at all. In the long list of medieval punishments designed not just to harm the body, but to humiliate the soul, the practice of the pillory stands out, not for its bloodshed, but for its endurance, its stillness, its awful simplicity. The pillory was a wooden structure, usually set up in a town square or near the marketplace, where all could see. Two hinged boards with holes for the neck and wrists clamped the accused into place, rendering them upright but utterly immobilized, head bowed, arms outstretched, a living exhibit of disgrace. This was not execution. It was something colder, slower, a punishment of exposure, a sentence of ridicule. You didn't bleed, you didn't scream. You simply stood there, helpless, while the world passed judgment not in law, but in rotten vegetables and spittle. The crowd gathered quickly, always. No matter how small the town, someone always came. The baker, the blacksmith, the children with too much energy and not enough kindness. They laughed. They pointed, some through filth. Others recited your alleged crimes loudly for those arriving late. Adulterer, thief, blasphemer, fraud. The pillory was used for many things, many people, and many wrongs. Some real, some invented. All punished the same way. With time, with stillness, with shame. Sometimes you were left there for hours, sometimes days. Rain soaked your clothes. Sun blistered your skin. You could not scratch your nose, swat a fly, wipe your eyes. Your body ached. Your legs shook. Your head throbbed from hanging so low. And still, the people came. Some out of boredom, others for the thrill. Occasionally, someone would take pity and try to slip you water or bread, but even that risked punishment, because helping someone in the pillory meant challenging the justice that placed them there. In some towns, the pillory was also a place of escalation. If the crowd grew too violent, if the guards were indifferent or absent, things could go further. Stones replaced apples. Fists followed insults. There were cases where people died, not from the pillory itself, but from what it invited. And when that happened, the boards were simply wiped down, the locks checked, and the next name was called. It was never about reform. It was about memory, about branding someone with the eyes of others. Even after the boards opened and your swollen wrists slipped free, you were marked. Not with ink, but with recognition. People remembered you. They turned away in the streets. They whispered. The pillory followed you long after you stepped away from it. And perhaps that was its true cruelty, not the pain, but the permanence. The way it took your name and wrapped it in mockery, in shame, in 100 voices that never quite went silent. Long after the wooden boards had rotted, long after the iron clasps had rusted away, the space where the pillory stood would still seem quieter than the rest of the square. People would walk faster near it, look elsewhere. And somewhere in that silence, the memory of what had been suffered there would still hang like a crooked shadow in the sun. There was a punishment so quiet in its cruelty, so deceptively simple in its design, that it often goes overlooked in the grim tapestry of medieval justice. Branding. A single mark, a moment of heat, and yet it was not the flame itself that did the lasting damage, but the life that followed. Branding was often carried out in full view of the town, in the square where the market bustled on normal days, but fell into a hush when the irons were brought out. A small fire was kindled early, long before the crowd arrived, feeding steadily until it glowed with a white-hot certainty. Iron rods, sometimes shaped like letters, sometimes symbols, were set in to warm, their purpose clear, their silence ominous. The condemned was brought forward in chains, often bare-chested, or with clothing ripped away from the spot to be marked. Sometimes the forehead, sometimes the cheek, more often the hand. The location chosen carefully to ensure that the mark could not be hidden. Because branding was not for the moment, it was for forever. The executioner, gloves thick and face unreadable, would lift the rod from the flame, its tip glowing like a small sun, and press it against the flesh in one swift, steady movement. There was no need to linger. The hiss was loud, the smell immediate, burned hair, charred skin, a sharp edge of panic. The branded one might scream or not, depending on what strength remained in them. The pain was searing, primal, but it passed. Quickly, even. It was what came next that lingered. The wound would swell, blister, weep. Infections were common. The shape, often an initial for a crime, a T for thief, an F for felon, a V for vagrant, would rise from the skin like a scar written in fire. And when it healed, it stayed. That was the point. So no matter where you went, no matter how many towns you passed through, how clean your clothes or honest your face, the mark would speak before you did. You could not run from it, not truly. Employers would turn you away. Inns would refuse you. Merchants would raise prices or offer nothing at all. Children stared. Strangers whispered. Every conversation began with a glance at your hand or your cheek. You were your punishment now, forever. And in a world where reputation was survival, that was its own kind of death. A slow one. You might live another 30 years, but never again as anything but what the brand claimed you were. Some tried to hide the mark, gloves in summer, hoods in churches, but suspicion followed concealment like a shadow. Others tried to burn the brand away themselves, hoping that fresh fire might erase old judgment. It never worked. Not really. The scar only deepened. The shame only rooted further. A few sought out quacks and charlatans promising salves, potions, spells to lift the mark. But magic, real or not, could not unwrite what society had already decided to see. The brand was a lifetime verdict, not from a court, but from everyone who saw you. And even those wrongly accused, even the innocent, if such a thing was possible in that time, carried it all the same. Because once the iron touched your skin, the truth no longer mattered. Only the mark. Only the silence that followed when you entered a room. Only the echo of that hiss, that burn, that moment in the square when you stopped being a person and became a warning. Branding didn't kill. It didn't bleed. But in many ways, it was the most efficient punishment of all, because it never ended. There was a punishment in medieval times that turned water into a weapon and time into a torturer. A sentence so subtle and so maddening that it left no blood, broke no bones, yet hollowed out the mind one drop at a time. It is remembered now as the drip torture, a method not often written into law, but whispered of in dungeons and rumored across stone corridors where the light never reached. It began in silence. No announcement. No audience. Just a prisoner bound, often on their back, sometimes in a dim chamber beneath a castle or cloister, where the only sound was the distant shuffle of rats or the muffled thud of footsteps overhead. Their head was fixed, their bodies strapped tightly to a board or a slab. They could not turn, could not shift, could not even nod, and above them, a single leak, a small stream of water, barely more than a trickle, had been arranged to fall in slow, steady intervals onto one fixed point of their forehead. Not a splash, not a flood, just a drop, and another, and another. At first, it seemed nothing more than discomfort. Cold, repetitive, annoying. But as hours passed and the body could not move, the drip began to burrow, not through flesh, but through sanity. Each drop came without warning, even when the rhythm felt predictable. The anticipation became worse than the contact. The mind began to flinch before the water ever fell, imagining the wet strike before it arrived. Sleep became impossible. Concentration dissolved. The prisoner could no longer think beyond the moment, beyond the next drop, beyond the wait between. It was not painful in the way of the rack or the wheel. There were no screams, only muttering, only the slow erosion of thought. The skin grew raw, the nerves frayed. Some prisoners wept. Others laughed without meaning. Still others begged for a sharper end, for blades, for fire, anything but the drip. And that was its power. It did not maim. It unraveled. The torturers would sometimes leave them there for days, returning only to offer scraps of bread, a splash of water to drink, and then, once again, the bindings, the board, and the endless falling drops. The cell would feel smaller each day. The dark would press in closer. The air itself seemed to lean heavier with every hour. And always, the water fell. Some tried to resist, focused on numbers, prayers, anything to anchor their minds. But repetition is a quiet predator. It waits. It whispers. It wears down even the strongest resolve. Not in a moment, but over 1,000 tiny ones. When the prisoner was finally released, if they were released, they were no longer the same. They blinked too often, twitched at invisible sounds, stared blankly at stone walls as though still expecting the next drop. The outside world, with its sounds and movement and sun, became overwhelming. And most who saw them didn't ask what had happened. They didn't need to. The madness spoke for itself. The drip torture left no wounds, no scars to name or display. But those who had endured it carried something worse than pain. They carried a silence that never left, a shiver at every drop of rain, a tremble in every quiet room. And long after their bodies had healed, their minds remained captive, caught in the space between drops, waiting forever for the next one to fall. In a world where the law was as much about spectacle as it was about order, there was a punishment that combined humiliation, physical torment, and the brutal amusement of the crowd, something grotesque in its simplicity, and yet deeply effective in its cruelty. The cucking stool. Also known as the ducking stool, this punishment was most often reserved for women accused of gossip, nagging, or scolding, crimes that today would seem absurd to prosecute, let alone punish. But in the medieval imagination, a loud or defiant woman was a threat to the harmony of the household and the authority of the husband, and so she was silenced, not with reason or debate, but with water and shame. The stool itself was a wooden chair mounted to a long beam, often placed on a pivot beside a river or pond. The accused woman was tied into it, her wrists and ankles bound, her clothing often soaked, even before the punishment began. From the fierce sweat and the weight of the gathering crowd, people came to watch. They always did. Not out of a sense of justice, but for the same reason crowds gather around any cruelty dressed as tradition. Because it distracted them, and because it wasn't happening to them. Children laughed, men jeered. Even other women, keen to stay on the right side of the law, turned their faces into masks of amusement. Once secured, the stool was swung out over the water, creaking as it moved, and then lowered with a swift, unceremonious drop, plunging the woman beneath the surface in a sudden rush of cold and chaos. She couldn't scream. Her mouth filled with water, her lungs burned. If she was lucky, she held her breath. If not, the panic took her before the water did. After a few long moments, long enough for the crowd to cheer, to laugh, to point, the stool was raised again. She emerged sputtering, coughing, hair plastered to her face, soaked and humiliated. But it wasn't over. It never was after just one dunk. The process was repeated, sometimes 3 times, sometimes 5, sometimes until the crowd grew bored or the magistrate nodded in satisfaction. There was no medical care afterward, no apology, no concern for hypothermia or injury. The woman was cut free and expected to crawl home, dripping, shivering, her shame following her like a second skin. The punishment didn't kill her, usually, Though some drowned, some hit their heads on the way down, some simply never came up again, especially if the bindings were too tight or the water too cold. But death wasn't the point. Survival was, because the real punishment wasn't the water. It was the memory. It was the whispers that followed her in the market, the way people stopped talking when she walked into a room, the way children mimicked her gasps and gurgles behind her back, the way her husband looked at her if he looked at her at all. And for what crime? Speaking too much, being heard too clearly, refusing to stay quiet. The cucking stool was not justice. It was control. It was fear turned into ritual. And even as the wooden beams rotted, and the ponds dried, and the laws changed, the memory of it lingers in every tale of witches drowned, every whisper of women too loud, too bold, too much. The stool may be gone, but the idea that silence can be forced, that shame can be soaked into the bones, still echoes like water dripping from old wood into a forgotten pond. And then there was the wheel, simple in shape, terrifying in purpose. Known in some places as the breaking wheel, in others as the Catherine wheel, it stood as one of the most gruesome punishments the medieval world had to offer, a slow, deliberate ritual of destruction performed not in secret, but often in the full glare of sunlight, on the edge of a field or in the center of a town square, where the air was thick with silence and the crowd barely dared to breathe. The condemned would be brought forth, bound hand and foot, often stripped to the waist or entirely, depending on the custom and the cruelty of the moment. The wheel itself was large, wooden, a cartwheel or something like it, propped horizontally or vertically, depending on the region, the era, and how much suffering was intended. The prisoner was not placed on the wheel so much as wrapped around it, limbs splayed across its spokes, or tied between two beams so that the joints were exposed, vulnerable, ready. The executioner stepped forward, sometimes with a hammer, sometimes with a heavy iron bar, and began, not with the neck, not with the heart, but with the arms, the legs, the places that would not kill, but would scream. Blow by blow, the bones were shattered. The radius, the ulna, the femur, the tibia, each one a note in a terrible rhythm, breaking beneath iron with a sound that sent ripples through the waiting crowd. Some screamed until their voices gave out. Others didn't scream at all, locked in a kind of numb horror that was worse than noise. The pain was unbearable by design. The body was twisted into an unnatural shape, wrapped like a broken vine around the wood. And then, when the limbs were ruined, when the body was no longer a person, but something else, something bent and wrong, the wheel might be hoisted upright, displayed on a tall post, left to spin slowly in the wind. Not for mercy, not for any last dignity, but so that all could see and learn. Sometimes death came quickly after that. If the executioner was instructed to show mercy, a final blow to the chest or head might be given, a release from agony. But often, mercy was denied. The broken body was left there to die slowly, over hours, sometimes days, the birds coming first, then the insects, the sun beating down until the skin blistered and cracked and peeled. And still, people watched, because this was not just punishment. It was a warning carved into the world in flesh and blood and splintered bone. The crimes that earned the wheel were many: murder, treason, robbery, even blasphemy, in some places. But the truth was, the wheel was used as much to terrify as to judge. It made an example. It turned a person into a message. And once the body was gone, once the bones had fallen into the grass or been picked clean by dogs and crows, the wheel itself sometimes remained, weathered, rusted, leaning like an old scarecrow against the sky. And people remembered, not the face of the one who died, but the shape of their body twisted in that final pose, the outline of suffering caught forever in wood and iron. The wheel didn't just kill, it unmade. And long after it stopped turning, it kept spinning in the minds of those who'd seen it. Slow, creaking, eternal. And if there was ever a punishment crafted purely from imagination's darkest corners, it was flaying. The removal of skin while the body still breathed. The quiet peeling away of the human shell, inch by inch, until nothing but raw, exposed nerve remained. It was not a punishment used lightly nor commonly, but when it was used, it was done to make a statement so horrifying, so unforgettable, that no one present could ever again hear the name of the condemned without feeling the ghost of that pain echoing through their own flesh. Flaying was reserved for what the rulers considered the most treasonous of acts: rebels, oath-breakers, those who challenged not just the law, but the very throne or church, because it wasn't just a death sentence. It was a symbolic unmaking, a declaration that you would be stripped not only of your life, but of your very humanity. It began with ropes, always, and silence. The prisoner, often gagged to muffle screams, was tied down in a cold chamber or out in the square if the message needed to travel far. The knife used was not large. It didn't need to be. Small, sharp, curved, meant not for cutting deep, but for gliding just beneath the surface. The executioner had to be skilled, patient, not out of kindness, but to keep the condemned alive as long as possible, to prolong the message, to turn minutes into eternities. The first incision was usually at the wrist or collarbone, a small cut. The blade slipped just under the skin, separating it from muscle, a sensation beyond imagining, because the skin, though thin, holds everything together. Once it was lifted even a little, the air itself became pain. From there, the knife would travel slowly, methodically, across the chest, the arms, the face. Yes, sometimes even the face. The skin peeled away in sheets or strips, depending on the condition of the body, the skill of the hand, and the cruelty of the moment. The exposed flesh wept blood. The nerves screamed, and the prisoner, if they were still conscious, often begged not for life, but for death. But death didn't come quickly. That was the point. People were made to watch, not just as deterrence, but as ritual. A priest might speak. A herald might read the list of offenses. The crowd stood silent at first, unable to look away, then gradually murmured, shuffled, and finally turned away, unable to stomach what they were seeing. And yet, the flaying continued. For some, it was done only partially, just the face or the hands, before the blade was laid down and the body left to die slowly of blood loss and shock. Others were skinned nearly entire, and only when the executioner was satisfied that the lesson had been etched into flesh, only then was the final mercy offered. A slit to the throat, a blow to the heart, a plunge of steel. But even in death, the punishment continued. The skin, if removed cleanly, might be tanned and displayed. Hung at the gates, nailed to the walls, a grim parchment bearing the last words or deeds of the condemned. A warning written not in ink, but in skin. The bones were buried, perhaps. The soul was left to the judgment of heaven. But the town remembered the smell, the sound, the look in the prisoner's eyes. And for years after, that square would seem quieter, the stone stained darker, the wind colder. Because flaying was not punishment, it was annihilation. A punishment not meant just to kill, but to unmake, to say, this is what happens when you rise too high, when you speak too loudly, when you forget your place. The body became a scroll, and the story it told was one no one ever wanted to read again. And then came the punishment that blurred the line between execution and art, where cruelty was shaped into choreography and death into a grim performance. The Blood Eagle. Whispers of it come mostly from the sagas, the legends passed down in the cold Northlands, where Viking lords and kings were said to inflict this ritual on traitors, on those who had broken oaths or murdered kin. Some doubt it ever happened. Some say it's only myth. But the truth, as always in the medieval world, is less about fact and more about belief. And people believed in the Blood Eagle, believed in it enough to fear it, to speak of it in lowered voices by firelight, to use its name as a curse or a threat. The ritual was as elaborate as it was horrifying. The condemned would be bound, sometimes standing, sometimes kneeling, their arms stretched wide like wings. They were stripped to the waist, their back exposed to the air, pale and shaking. Then the blade, always a blade, never a club or axe, would begin its work. The executioner, often a warrior himself, would cut into the back, slicing through the skin, the muscle, down to the ribs. Blood spilled early and did not stop. And then, one by one, the ribs were broken near the spine and pulled outward like the struts of a grotesque wing, splayed open from the inside out. Each snap echoed in the ears of the onlookers, a slow rhythm of ruin. The lungs were the final part. Once the ribs were spread, they were pulled out as well, dragged through the opening and arranged across the back like folded wings. Some say salt was poured on the wounds. Others say the lungs were still breathing when they were moved, fluttering like the wings of a dying bird. Whether this is true or not, the point was never medical precision. It was terror. It was poetry and blood. The Blood Eagle wasn't about ending a life. It was about sending a message. This is what happens to those who betray. This is what loyalty means, not just death, but a death remembered. A death carved into story. It was not public, like the stocks or gallows. It was often done in a sacred place, or on a battlefield, or on the very spot where the betrayal occurred. There were no crowds, only warriors, brothers, witnesses who would carry the tale home, tell it in mead halls, shape it into song. And for the one being torn apart, there was no final speech. No words at all. Just breathing, if they could manage it. Just pain, just sky. Whether they screamed or not was said to matter. A true warrior, it was claimed, would endure it in silence, would show no fear even as their body was turned inside out. But even that silence was a trap. It didn't matter. It never mattered. Because pain has no voice that anyone listens to in the moment of punishment. Only the memory lingers, the image, the idea, and that was what the blood eagle was. A symbol carved not just in flesh, but into time. The wings, the ribs, the red trail soaking into the earth. Whether it was real, whether it was ritual, whether it was exaggerated in the telling, none of that matters now. What matters is that people believed. They believed it could be done, that a man could be broken open like a chest, that his lungs could be lifted skyward, that his death could become a warning that would fly farther than any raven. That belief gave it power and fear, and a place in history where the body became a message, and the message was simple. Do not betray. Do not rise. Do not forget who holds the knife. There was a punishment designed not to bleed the body, but to crush it slowly, quietly, under the relentless weight of stone and silence. A method as brutal as it was methodical, known in some corners as pressing, or more formally, peine forte et dure. It was rarely used, but when it was, it sent ripples through villages and towns, because it was the kind of death that unfolded with an eerie patience, stretching minutes into hours, hours into days, until the breath was wrung out of the chest like water from a rag. This punishment was usually reserved for those who refused to plead in court, an act seen not as silence, but as defiance. In a world where confession was often more important than truth, refusing to speak was its own kind of threat. And so the law found a way to make silence scream. The condemned would be taken to a flat surface, sometimes a wooden board, sometimes the cold floor of a cell. They were laid out flat, arms spread, legs bound. Then a door, or plank, or heavy beam was placed atop their chest, and then the stones began. One at a time, slowly, deliberately, each stone placed with care, not dropped, not thrown, but laid, as if each one were a sacred offering to the gods of law and order. The weight pressed downward. It didn't slice or pierce. It simply compressed. The first stones caused discomfort. The next made breathing harder. After a while, the lungs struggled to expand. The ribs began to bend. The spine ached. Every breath became shallow, desperate, clawing for space. The heart, caged beneath layers of stone and flesh, pounded against the closing door. And yet, the executioners waited. They did not rush. The weight had to do its work, slowly. Too quick, and it would be over. Too sudden, and it would not make the right impression. The goal was not merely death. It was surrender. They wanted the prisoner to speak, to confess, to beg, to say something. But many did not. Some held on for hours, refusing to give their voice to a system they knew would twist it. Others gave in eventually, whispering a plea through lips darkening from lack of air. And for some, the ones remembered in whispers, it went on for days. The body, unable to move, began to break down. Muscles tore, organs bruised. The weight crushed more than bones. It crushed the self. And still, the stones came. until the final one, the stone that silenced everything, the one that ended the struggle and left the chest still, the mouth open, the eyes wide but empty. There was no gallows cheer, no dramatic end, just quiet. A death not marked by blood, but by breath that could no longer find room in the chest. The board would be lifted, the stones removed, and the body, flat, ruined, shrunken, was carried away. Sometimes buried, sometimes burned. Always forgotten by the law, but not by the people. Because everyone who saw it, everyone who heard the slow stacking of stones knew that this was not justice. This was control, a punishment for silence, a lesson that the body would be broken if the mouth refused to open. Peine forte et dure, strong and hard punishment. But what it truly was quiet terror, the kind of death that didn't shout, didn't bleed, didn't strike. It waited, it pressed, it taught. And in its stillness, it became one of the most feared executions of them all, not for its spectacle, but for its silence. And then there was the cage, a punishment that did not kill quickly, did not bleed, did not cut or crush, but instead held its victims in place and let time do the rest. There was no need for an axe or rope or blade, only the relentless passage of days, the slow shifting of the sun, the hunger that gnawed from within, and the stares of every passerby who came to see what it meant to be truly, utterly trapped. The cage was simple in design, but terrible in purpose. It could be made of iron or wood, large enough to stand in or small enough to barely sit. Some were shaped like the human form, so close to the body that movement was impossible. Others hung from walls or posts, exposed to wind, rain, birds. They were often placed in public view, not just for humiliation, but as a living warning. They would say, "This is what happens when you steal or betray or disobey. This is what happens when you step outside the line drawn by those in power." A person locked in a cage did not die quickly. That was the point. There was no final blow, no sharp end, just the long wait for the body to give in to what it could no longer escape. Hunger arrived first. Within a day or two, it curled around the belly, tightened the muscles, made the hands tremble. Then thirst, cracking lips, a swollen tongue. Eyes that darted not from fear, but from the search for any drop of water, rain, dew, anything. If they were lucky, it rained. If they were not, the sun did its work without mercy. The skin blistered, the mouth dried to dust, and the days passed slowly. Birds came next, sometimes ravens, sometimes gulls. They circled above, then landed nearby, emboldened by the smell of weakness. Insects followed, flies in the mouth, ants between the toes, worms if the cage was close to the ground. The body remained conscious far longer than it wanted to, and even when the mind began to slip into delirium, the pain remained. The embarrassment, the fear. People walked past. Some stared, some mocked, some looked away quickly, their stomachs twisting. Children were told to look and remember. This is what happens. Some cages were left until death, others until the condemned begged to die. Some prisoners were fed small amounts to prolong the punishment, not out of mercy, but to stretch it further, to turn days into weeks. And even when the person inside finally stilled, when the body sagged against the iron and the breath had left, the cage was not opened, not yet. The corpse was left to hang, to rot, to become part of the town's air, the smell creeping through windows, the outline of the body always there in the corner of one's eye. Eventually, bones fell through the gaps. Birds took pieces away. And finally, someone, usually a low-ranking worker or outcast, was told to remove what remained. But the cage stayed, emptied now, swinging gently in the wind, a hollow echo of the body that once filled it. And the message remained. You could see it in the way people walked faster past that post, the way children fell silent when they neared, the way no one ever stood too close. It wasn't just death that the cage delivered. It was isolation, slow decay, the complete stripping away of comfort, movement, dignity. It showed that you didn't need to beat someone to break them. You only had to hold them still. Let the world do the rest. Let the hunger speak. Let the sun watch. Let the rain fall. The cage did not roar. It whispered. And for those who passed it every day, that whisper stayed long after the body had gone. And then there was boiling, a punishment so viscerally grotesque, so deliberately theatrical, that it seemed designed not only to kill, but to burn the image of suffering into every watching mind, a method where death was not just endured, but displayed, piece by scalding piece. In some kingdoms, it was reserved for poisoners, those who had dared to kill, not with blade or battle, but with a cup of wine or a bowl of stew, the silent, invisible kind of murder that left kings afraid of their kitchens and wives afraid of their servants. To punish such stealth, the execution had to be anything but quiet. A large cauldron was used, filled with oil, pitch, water, or even molten lead, depending on the kingdom's cruelty and the crime's severity. It was placed over a roaring fire, often in a public square, where the heat of the flames mixed with the stench of bubbling fat. The condemned was brought forward, often bound and stripped, not for humiliation, but because cloth would cling and conceal, and they wanted the witnesses to see everything. Sometimes they were lowered in all at once. More often, they were eased in slowly, feet first, inch by inch, so the screams could stretch into a kind of music, each note rising as skin blistered, as muscles cooked, as nerves shattered beneath the surface. The boiling did not kill instantly. It worked its way upward, destroying flesh, melting fat, softening bones. The face twisted in agony. But the real horror was the sound, a mixture of shrieks and the soft, wet bubbling as the body fought the liquid that seared it alive. Some accounts said people tried to push themselves out of the cauldron with what remained of their limbs. Others fainted from pain, only to awaken again with fresh nerves alight. It could last minutes, sometimes longer. Death came from shock, or from organs shutting down, or from drowning if the condemned collapsed forward into the churning brew. But even then, the body did not vanish. It boiled, it stewed, it fell apart in pieces. And once the fire died, and the cauldron cooled, someone was tasked with removing what was left. A spine, maybe. A jaw. Charred muscle clinging to bone. And always the smell, thick and heavy, staining the air like smoke that clung to the walls and lingered in the mouths of those who watched. The pot might be scrubbed, the square might be hosed, but the memory never left. Children would whisper about it for years. Merchants would avoid that corner of the street. And every servant who poured a drink would think, if only for a moment, about the price of unseen crimes. Boiling was not just death. It was spectacle, a statement, a punishment not only for the one submerged, but for everyone who looked on and thought, could that be me? Could that be someone I know? It was the kind of cruelty that made an example not by the body, but by the method. Slow, loud, unforgettable. And so it remained in the annals of justice. Not as a deterrent, not as a triumph, but as proof of what rulers could do when fear guided their hands. The fire would go out, the pot would be emptied, but the terror would boil on. And then there was the punishment of flaying, an execution so cruel, so methodical in its violence, that even in a time defined by pain, it stood apart as something else entirely, something more than death. Flaying was not designed to kill efficiently or even quickly. It was designed to unmake a person while they were still alive, to peel away not just skin, but identity, voice, presence. It was, in every sense, the slow erasure of a human being, layer by layer. The condemned would be tied, sometimes upright against a post, sometimes laid out on a board, limbs splayed so that no movement could interrupt the work. The blade used was not large. It didn't need to be. A small, sharp knife, honed to a whisper, was all that was required. And the executioner, more butcher than soldier, began at the extremities. Fingers, toes, the edge of the scalp. The knife would dig under the skin, not to cut, but to lift, to separate. It was not a slicing action, but a peeling one, where the flesh was tugged and coaxed and drawn away from the muscle beneath. There was no single cut. There were hundreds, thousands, each one a message to the nerves. You are still alive. You are still here. And the condemned screamed. Not at first, perhaps, because the body protects itself in moments of terror, but eventually the mind caught up to what was happening, and the pain became something not contained in a limb or a joint, but in the air, in the soul, in every cell. Blood ran, of course, but not in spurts. It oozed, slow and thick, mixing with sweat and dirt and tears. The face, once recognizable, became a mask of red. The chest rose and fell in jagged gasps. The eyes remained open because they were not touched, not yet. The skin, as it was removed, might be displayed, hung like a tapestry, tacked to the walls of a city gate. Sometimes it was salted to preserve it, to turn it into a relic of warning. And the body, if it survived the process, if the heart still beat after the skin was gone, was left to die not from wounds, but from exposure. The air itself became a weapon. Every breeze, every breath, every movement a new form of agony. And when death finally arrived, it was a mercy that had taken far too long to come. This punishment was not common. It required time. It required intent. It was used for traitors, for enemies of the state or church, for those whose bodies were meant to speak after death, to remind others that disobedience would not only be punished, it would be erased. People who witnessed the flaying did not sleep well afterward. They did not tell jokes or sing songs. They walked away in silence, eyes wide, stomachs churning, hearts racing. And they remembered, always. They remembered the sound of the blade working its way across a thigh, the color of exposed muscle twitching beneath, the look on a face that no longer had a name. Flaying did not just end a life. It rewrote the memory of that life. It turned a person into a message, a warning, a story to be told in hushed tones across generations. And that was its purpose. In a world without mass communication, without headlines or newsprint, the body was the billboard. Pain was the punctuation. And death, when it finally arrived, was only the period at the end of a sentence written in blood and silence. And then there was the breaking wheel, a device so mercilessly thorough in its destruction that it became legend, not because it was rare, but because it was remembered by everyone who heard the crack of bone beneath wood. Known in parts of Europe as the Catherine wheel, it was not elegant, not efficient, not clean. It was designed to draw out suffering, to create a death so fractured that even those too young to understand would know, instinctively, to be afraid of it. The wheel itself was simple, a large wooden structure, often similar to a cartwheel, sturdy and unforgiving. The condemned was brought forward in chains, and the public gathered, not with reverence or solemnity, but with a strange mix of fear and festivity. Because in a world where daily life was shadowed by disease, hunger, and war, suffering became theater, and the wheel was center stage. The prisoner was stripped, tied down with limbs spread wide, either directly on the ground or placed atop the wheel itself. Sometimes their arms and legs were woven through the spokes, like threads through a loom. And then came the executioner, holding a heavy iron bar or hammer, not sharp, not pointed, just dense, like the punishment it would deliver. There was an order to the strikes. They were not random. The limbs were broken systematically. First the lower legs, then the thighs, then the forearms and upper arms. Each blow was meant not to kill, but to ruin, to crush the bone without severing flesh. The skin might swell and split, but the real work was inside, where the bones snapped like dry twigs, where the marrow spilled, where the structure of the human form was dismantled piece by piece. The body would begin to twist, unnaturally, grotesquely, as limbs lost their shape and bent in impossible directions. And through it all, the condemned screamed, or didn't. Some fainted from pain. Some held their silence, not out of bravery, but because the shock had stolen their voice. And when the bones were all broken, when the body had become a rag of itself, it was not over. The wheel was hoisted upright, displayed like a banner of what justice could do. The shattered prisoner might still be alive, clinging to a breath they didn't want, hung on the wheel like a tangle of meat and memory. Birds came first. Crows, usually, clever and cruel. Then flies. Then rot. If death had not already come, it arrived slowly, through infection or exposure, or the simple fact that a body can only hold so much pain. Days could pass. In rare cases, a person survived for hours, even longer, moaning softly while the town carried on below. And when death finally arrived, there was no burial. The body was left there, bones twisted around wood, until only scraps remained. A skeleton braided into the wheel like it had always belonged there. Children grew up with it in their view. Lovers walked past it in the evening, and those who had seen the punishment done never forgot the sound, the deep, dull sound of the iron bar meeting flesh and breaking it. The wheel was not just a punishment, it was a promise, a message carved into the landscape. It said, "Your body is not yours if you defy. It can be taken apart, publicly, loudly, without apology, and in its place, only silence will remain." And then there was the brazen bull, a device so theatrical in its horror that it blurred the line between punishment and performance, cruelty and craft. Forged entirely of bronze, often shaped with exquisite detail, it stood as a sculpture, gleaming, lifelike, the size of a real bull, with curved horns, flared nostrils, and a hollow belly. From a distance, it might be mistaken for art. Up close, it was something else entirely. The condemned would be stripped and forced through a small door carved into the side of the bull. It was cramped inside, metal walls pressing in on all sides, the air already stifling, and no room to move once the door slammed shut behind them. And then, beneath the belly of the bull, a fire was lit. Slowly at first, then higher, until the flames kissed the bronze and began to transform the sculpture into a furnace. The metal grew hot, then blistering, then radiant with heat. Inside, the person screamed. And here was the design. Clever, obscene, deliberate. The interior of the bull was built with acoustic tubes, channels that reshaped the cries of the dying into something else. The howls of agony were funneled through the throat of the bronze beast, twisted into the sounds of bellowing, into animalistic groans, so that the bull itself seemed to cry out in fury and pain. It roared as its prisoner burned alive, the air inside becoming fire, the skin blistering, the lungs cooking from within. The crowd, because this was almost always a public affair, would watch, not just the fire, not just the bull, but the sound. They heard it snort, scream, rage. They watched smoke rise from its nostrils. They heard the echo of torment turned into theater. The condemned inside could do nothing but crawl, writhe, slam fists against the boiling walls. But the bronze did not give. It absorbed every blow, reflected every scream, amplified every final, wordless plea. Death came slowly, by asphyxiation, by heat stroke, by flesh roasted to uselessness. And when the fire burned down, the door was opened. Sometimes with ceremony, sometimes with indifference. What remained inside was charred, sometimes fused to the bronze. Bones blackened, skin peeled, teeth clenched in a silence that came too late. The bull was cleaned out, scraped, polished, readied for the next, because it was not a single-use tool. It was a symbol of the state's power, of the ingenuity of suffering, of how far humans were willing to go not just to punish, but to perform that punishment. Legend says that even the man who invented the brazen bull, an artisan named Perilos, was forced inside it as a test by the ruler he built it for. Whether true or not, the story feels fitting. Because in the medieval world, even cruelty could be turned against its creator. And machines like this did not forget. The brazen bull remained, over years, over generations, as more than an instrument. It became a kind of character in the story of punishment, faceless, roaring, filled with a heat that remembered every soul it swallowed. And long after it cooled, long after the crowds had gone, the silence it left behind was deafening. Not just because of the pain it caused, but because of how easy it had become to turn death into spectacle and suffering into song. And then there was the punishment of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. A sentence so elaborate in its violence, so methodical in its cruelty, that it served not only as an end to life, but as a public ritual of erasure. It was reserved for those accused of high treason, a charge that in the eyes of kings and courts was not simply disobedience, but betrayal so profound that it required a punishment deeper than death, something that spoke to the soul of a nation and tore it apart, piece by piece, just as the condemned would be. The process began not in private, but in full view, under open sky, where the townsfolk could gather and watch. The accused would be tied to a wooden hurdle or board and dragged by horse from prison to the place of execution, face down across mud and stone, through jeering crowds and silent spectators, the journey slow and deliberate, a parade of humiliation that painted the day with dread. There was no kindness in the dragging. Limbs scraped raw, skin flayed by gravel, bones jarred with each turn of the wheel, the smell of horses and sweat mixing with the early stink of fear. When they reached the gallows, there was no simple drop. The condemned was hanged, but not to death. No neck snapped in swift finality. They were left to dangle, choking, limbs flailing, eyes bulging, tongue swelling, the rope cutting into skin as the world narrowed to the sound of their own blood pounding behind the ears.